Good morning, or what's left of it. Along with grace and law, the Apostle Paul is known for another magnificent, confusing, and often misunderstood duality in his writings: strength and weakness. Now, I don't want to sound dismissive of these dualities, although all of the God's friends / God's enemies stuff in Philippians could use some work. But in each of these paradoxes, we are left to stand in awe as the great exhorter from Tarsus first constructs and then beautifully overcomes these dualities. Literally speaking, it is beautiful. When I am weak, then I am strong, we read in 2 Corinthians. Now, some call this the spirituality of imperfection, which, as a cradle Episcopalian, I grew up assuming was nothing more than the gospel. But the problem is that over the years, this has often been made into an impossible spirituality of perfection by popular Christianity, which is a paradox in and of itself. But thankfully, there have been bright spots in the great cloud of witnesses who are great exceptions to the upwardly mobile trend found in most corners of mainline Christianity. In his earliest biography, St. Francis is quoted as teaching the friars, "We must bear patiently not being good and not being thought good." Well, this blows apart the whole self-esteem trend that I grew up with, as the common assumption is that one primarily needs to think well of oneself. In addition to her French name requiring me to learn how to put the little accent marks in while using Microsoft Word, Thérèse Lisieux, who lived just over 100 years ago, teaches the same as Francis. However, she has the gall, get it, because she's French, tough crowd, to call it a new way. She actually calls it her little way and called herself a little flower in God's big garden. This spirituality of imperfection, above all else, undermines the egoic use of religion for the sole purpose of making you feel better about yourself. Quite simply, both Frankie and Terry recognize that you come to God not by being strong, but by being weak, not by being right, but through your mistakes, not by self-admiration, but by self-forgetfulness. I hope this isn't shocking news. Both Jesus and Paul taught it rather clearly. But I assume it was just too obvious or simple or counterintuitive to be true. This teaching utterly levels the playing field of holiness so all losers can win, which is everybody, and not just the clergy of this diocese. Now, this new and revolutionary consciousness came about when Paul first encountered the eternal Christ on the Damascus Road, because that is where he recognized that he had been chosen by God even while breathing murderous threats. Also important to note that Paul seems to note that the God who chose him was a crucified God and not an omnipotent or an almighty God. In fact, Paul never uses the word almighty for the divine, despite its common usage today. No, his image of God was of someone crucified outside the city walls in a way a slave might be killed, and not of a God appearing on heavenly clouds. Christ was not the strong, powerful, military Messiah that the Jews had been waiting for throughout their history of being enslaved, oppressed, occupied, and colonized. Surely Paul saw in his own Jewish family that God consistently chooses the weak to confound the strong. Read the first chapter of 1 Corinthians and you will see that this becomes Paul's very definition of wisdom. But Paul didn't go through anything that we haven't. when his view of himself, of God, and of all others was turned on its head. He had to utterly redefine how divine power worked and how humans changed. And all he knew for sure at the beginning was that it was not what anyone expected. He even went off to, quote, Arabia for perhaps as long as 3 years to pray, to test his ideas against the tradition, and to slowly allow the metamorphosis of his soul. In other words, Paul went to seminary. But in all seriousness, which among us, at least, could claim a great variance in our own continuing discernment? It's only later that Paul gets up the courage to confront Peter and James in Jerusalem. That's the first chapter of Galatians. And a full 14 years later, he tells Peter to his face that Peter is wrong for imposing non-essentials on Peter. And it seems that Peter, the first pope, was indeed fallible. Folks, it takes a long time to move from power to weakness, from glib certitude to vulnerability, from meritocracy to pure grace. In Paul's letters, he consistently idealizes not power, but powerlessness, and not strength, but weakness. It's as if he's saying, I glory when I fail and suffer, because now I get to be like Jesus, the naked loser God. Jesus' death and resurrection forever redefine what success and winning mean, and it's not what any of us want or expect. On the cross, God is revealed as vulnerability itself, the Latin word vulnera meaning woundedness. We ourselves grow through vulnerability and not through any need to posture or pose or present. This is all terribly clever of God. Now only the humble will ever find God. This is not an extension or a veneer on the good news, my sisters and brothers. This is the gospel.